Hi. So I've been putting together this PowerPoint over the last week as a way of trying to visualize everything that I've sort of going in my head around what I think the problem of poetry as a field currently is, and how we can bring some clarity into it. So if a simple look online on The Guardian or any other poetry website or newsletter or newspaper or magazine covering cultural matters will clearly reveal I think, not just the fact that there are so many different debates and tensions going on in poetry, but also that a lot of it actually boils down to the debate between form and formlessness, and the purpose of poetry, whether it should be for personal and political self-expression. Carroll and Duffy called it poetry is the same as texting, and it's the equivalent of a selfie in a verbal medium, which Geoffrey Hill, completely the very, I think, famous, well-known in poetry circles, British poet Geoffrey Hill, he thought that was completely wrong, and that instead poetry should achieve a kind of formal expressiveness. It's not about self-expression. It's about making formal structures speak. And I can go more into that in a little bit, but what I kind of just wanted to indicate on this slide is the fact that there are lots of debates going on in the poetry field, and that a lot of them have to do with this form versus formlessness issue. This is also reflected on the poetry community on Substack. I won't go into this in too much detail, but there are a lot of comments every day you see on Substack, people engaging in the same debates that are the field in general is being torn apart by. And there was recently a nautical poetry themed sort of, I don't know what you would call it, series of poems about the function of poetry written by Substack poets, some arguing for a more rigorous sort of application of meter and formal accomplishment and polish to poetry, and some arguing for something deeper, for meaning. I thought meaning was good, but still insufficient, and that's what I'm going to lead towards. But I just wanted to, again, indicate in this slide that it is the problem of poetry, to put it that way, is not only in the broader field, but also reflected on Substack. So I want to draw an analogy to what Dr. Greg Enriquez, a psychologist, has called the problem of psychology. In a nutshell, what he argued was that psychologists, since it was effectively brought online by Freud and Jung, has more or less, they have operated and theorized in silos, and no one has done any work to synthesize all the different schools of psychology into an overarching framework or map, which he calls UTOK, the Unified Theory of Knowledge. And so what he's trying to do is he's trying to integrate, for instance, the Rogerian with the Freudian, and he does so with a number of different schools of psychology. And because he just strikes me as someone who is very aware of the lack of any kind of coherent map, which is particularly important in psychology. But I'm drawing an analogy. The same is present in poetry. There isn't what I'm going to call a developmental ontological map, which is a fancy way of saying, Plotinus would call it that what he said was that we need a map of the different levels of knowing and how they sync up with different levels of being or reality. So the more developed we become, the deeper our access into reality becomes, and that's the ontological part. So what I'm trying to say is, first of all, I'm trying to say that there is a map of development. That alone seems to be not yet fully realized and metabolized by society, but I'm talking specifically here about the poetry society, community field as well. And so currently, because it isn't accepted that there is a map of development that actually tracks and does justice to all the unique individual variations that we see. Because we don't have that, what we have is this big blue circle. Everything just kind of everything's mashed together. So when we are doing a poetry workshop, for instance, and lots of poets are giving their feedback to one another, and some people are talking about the need for to polish up line 13 so that the illusion is less on the nose, or whatever it might be, and there's a real formal focus. That is going to be very different to someone who is just trying to write to be expressive and to reach people in a more directly sentimental kind of way, which is in turn going to be different from people who may be looking to capture something deeper. And because there isn't any kind of overarching map that provides a structure that shows how all of these different poets are actually at different levels of development, and therefore they have access to different parts of reality, it all just gets merged together, and as a result, we don't operate with, I think, the tact and skillfulness that we could in, for instance, workshop settings, but also in terms of just, I think, more generally, the kinds of how we engage with and celebrate poetry, and where we're moving, I guess, as a field. So what I'm trying to say is that we need some kind of a nested hierarchy that we can look at, or something like a developmental sequence that we can track. It might be worth addressing now that there is, I think, somewhat justifiably, a fear or concern about developmental hierarchy, and that is why there has been, I think there's multiple reasons for why there's been a real pluralistic push in theoretic, academic discourse and theorizing lately with postmodern and metamodern conversations going on around that. And I think there's a fear of it being a developmental sequence just not how do I put it? People are afraid of feeling inferior, and they're afraid of it being, leveraged and weaponized against them, and no one wants to be at the bottom. And who's making the rules anyway? Who is it that is privileging themselves? All of those, I think, are critical questions that need to be taken into account. And I for one, am always skeptical of any theorist who creates a developmental hierarchy and then puts themselves at the top, which suffice it to say is not what I'm going to do here. So, but so to address that concern, what I will say is that I think we're on some level doing this anyway. We are unconsciously projecting out developmental sequences anyway. We just leave them unspoken and unconscious for fear of threatening others. And so I think we do need to bring it into the light and integrate it so that we can ultimately handle these kinds of discussions more tactfully, but then also actually use this system to enrich our poetics and our poetry. Okay, so this is the proposal. On the first level, we have what I'm going to call the sentimentals, the sentimental type of poet, who creates poetry that I've called whim poetry, because it is essentially following their whim. And what I'm saying, the material that they work with primarily is either sentiment or emotion, which I think my little icon is going to cover up, but emotions is basically the subjective. So for whim, this is what the poetry establishment essentially doesn't celebrate. So people like Geoffrey Hill, who represent the scholar level of development, they are going to look down on the sentimentals. They're going to look down on the formal expressive, the self-expression without any kind of formal polish, as being essentially undisciplined, which it is. That's because the scholar has moved beyond the sentimental stage and is trying to make the subjective objective, whereas the sentimental is still moving. They are moving up from what we could just call the sensorial types. So that's the masses who haven't yet moved into poetic speech and haven't yet elaborated their subjective emotions. So the sentimental is a step up from that, because they are actually starting to become more subjective. The scholar has moved beyond that and is now making the subjective objective. The scholars, the people who are currently running and who have control over the poetry establishment, they write primarily for themselves. They are celebrated by themselves. Critics celebrate them, and critics they are literally scholars. They will get less, because they are more complex than the masses. they're going to get less. And again, this is what I'm trying to lay out, that the masses are a part of this developmental sequence as well, which is the instinctive man who is in his senses, and he doesn't have the yet elaboration of the poetic gift of the word. So the scholars aren't going to reach as many people, but they will be celebrated. The sentimentals won't be celebrated, but they're going to reach more people, and they may become quite famous among the masses, and they will be the number one on the Amazon bestseller list, and so on and so forth. What I want to say is, I mean, there's quite a few things here. The scholars and the sentimentals both share a collective, I want to say, value system. So they're both essentially, they haven't yet differentiated themselves from the herd in terms of their core value or belief system. Their identity is still in service of the collective worldview. So although the scholar has much more complexity, it's still in service of the same ordinary, conventional, actually it's probably a better word than ordinary, conventional worldview. They are scholars concerned with ethics and aesthetics, not emotions, ethics and aesthetics. So they are starting to gesture, not yet embody or capture, but gesture towards the higher things of the spirit. But they do so in a way that represents the things of the spirit, like real morality and real truth and wisdom and love and virtue, as relatively static things. I've used the word ethics because it captures the academic connotation of what the academics have done to the virtues, which is, kill them, stultify them, turn them into an arid disciplinary study. And likewise with aesthetics, they do beauty, they do create beautiful works, but it's the beauty of it is, if you can know how to see it, it's still relatively two-dimensional. So the issue is that the sentimentals and the scholars make up the majority of the poetry community. And the scholars are essentially, they believe themselves to be the top of the hierarchy. The sentimentals don't quite, although they definitely frame it that way to themselves, because everyone wants to be at the top of the hierarchy. The sentimentals identify as the rebel that is actually speaking the truth, which is why so many people want to listen to them, and they're actually doing the thing that's healing, and they're in touch with the people. The scholars think that they're doing the thing that's actually going to last, and that they're actually engaging with tradition, and etc., etc. So they believe themselves to be at the top of the hierarchy. The problem is that the scholars tend to be the ones with power, because they are the majority and they make up the poetry establishment proper. So they can be quite cruel, as I'll cover in a little bit, to the people below them and above them. Okay, so moving on to the next one. The senses. So the senses create what I call wild poetry. Oh, and I should say scholars create wrought poetry. Wrought captures I think it has a connotation of artificial that I quite like, but also formally polished, which is what it is. The senses create a wildness or a wild poetry, and the material they work with is essence. Essence is, I think, a very difficult thing to try to frame philosophically, because I just don't know that it's been done that well. I think there are, what would you call it? We can find references to it. We can find things. The German Romantic philosophy, Goethe's philosophy of delicate empiricism. We can find things philosophically to justify, legitimize, license, undergird what essence is, but I think it's probably going to be easier if I try to articulate it. I'll do so only briefly because we could talk about it for a long time, and I have alluded to it in previous videos. Essence is the directly sensed, that's why they're the senses, field of reality. I mean, I'll just put it that simply. You could say of consciousness, because they are the same thing. And I know I'm making a lot of moves here that are going to be possibly hard to follow if you don't have the sense for what I'm talking about, but that will come in time. They don't do what the scholar does, which is with their concrete analytical mind view. They freeze reality and then they analyze it and pull it apart and represent it in their own work. The censor is able to directly commune with that reality. They have a sense for it, and it comes through them as often like one essence at a time, and an essence is more. It's like this. It's curious because it doesn't work the way the concrete mind, analytical mind, would think that it does. It's not a factotum or a singular piece of data. It's more like a world that you enter. So you blend with it in your being, and it opens up. It has whole realities inside of it. And again, we could draw on like David Bohm here, and his notion of, I think he calls it folded or implicit realities, sort of folded, nested within a space-time, instance of space-time. I'd have to look at the specifics there, but again, we can find things to get at this. It is basically just being able to directly communicate with something in reality. It is the thing that most scholars really don't want to be the case. They don't want to be true. And sentimentals too. And this is partly because it means that they're not at the top of the hierarchy, but also because that seems to scare them. They want things to just be ultimately at a distance, and they don't want people who can actually just speak the truth of something directly from that place, because that then implies that there are different places that you can move consciously, and that's a what would you call, that's a thread they don't want to pull on. So it reminds me of a quote of a teacher, a professor, and someone said, "How do you become such a good philosopher and you know how to say all these things?" And he says, it's not about like learning what to say. You are the thing itself. And that was the quote that he said, which I think kind of indicates or points at the thing that I'm trying to get at as well. I think that only about 1% of poetry achieves this. Usually, by the way, essence comes through in a haunting way, because it's consciousness. It's something that's beyond just the analytical mind. and it's beyond just emotion. Now, I tried to use these terms senses and sentimentals. They start the same way because there is some overlap there. Both tend towards something that is a bit more free-flowing, and there's more of a being state connect to it. Senses, sentimentals. Sentimentals and senses both inhabit the thing that they're talking about. Scholars tend to approach it from a distance, which is what I tried to carry into the scryers at the top. Scholars, tried to carry that beginning, the sk sound across, because I'm trying to show that there is an analogy here between the two of them as well, because both of them try to understand things in a complete, systematic sort of way. The difference is, of course, that the scryer is perceiving things directly, what I would call like eidos, or whole patterns of human behavior, and not just their behavior objectively, but the meaning of those events, the essence of those events. And that's why I think William Butler Yeats said that about Blake. He said that Blake was like a fountain spray of beauty, so it wasn't just one static represented beauty that's coming through. It's rather a fountain spray beauty, because it's a smorgasbord. That's the wrong kind of word to draw in, but roll with me. It's the whole. It's a panoply. It is a multitude of essences that are also seen in context of a broader, larger vision and whole. This is about, there's only a handful of poets that have achieved this. Blake, Dante, Shakespeare, and Goethe. And so, yes, that would be, these scryers create wisdom poetry. And this is what I argue is needed. This is the latent or the underlying sequence of development that we can see in poetry. Okay, so what I've just put in this slide is that we must, in the final analysis, reckon these four types distinct from one another in complexity, depth, development, and the material they are working with. This kind of poet, Ocean Vuong, is a entirely different being from Geoffrey Hill. If you've read Geoffrey Hill's work, you know that it is dense, labyrinthine, it is obscure, it is learned, it is erudite, and just to say the word again, because it's appropriate, it is dense. He is trying to, as in his own words, make formal structures speak, and he is doing a lot of things that are really complex ethically and aesthetically. He is trying to incorporate an entire tradition of English poetry. It's very he's not trying to, as again by his own admission, he's not trying to create selfies. He thinks that that's actually antithetical to what poetry should be. But in turn, I think that is there's something essentially different, pardon the pun, between Geoffrey Hill and William Butler Yeats. Yeats is doing something, again, that I think is completely different. Now, Hill likes Yeats, and he talks about Yeats's relationship to craft, and he admires it, and he tries to embody it himself. He does successfully embody it himself. But I think if we just looked at Yeats as a craftsman, we lose something, again, pardon the pun, essential. Because Yeats is also trying to reach beyond. He's also trying to divine. That's his Celtic heritage coming through. He is trying to directly apprehend and experience essences, something spiritual, a trace of something spiritual and real that he's trying to capture and bring through. So he has a, let's say, an ontology, a map of reality and development that is different to Geoffrey Hill. The scholar doesn't tend to let in the spiritual in that way, and Yeats does, and I think that marks him out as being quite distinct from Hill. And then finally, Yeats, though he aspired to be like Shakespeare in many ways, and that's what we see that he writes as much in his A Vision, where he talks about where Shakespeare is on the cycle of all the masks and anti-masks, and I won't go into Yeats's esoteric theory there, but Shakespeare is ultimately doing something, again, quite different from Yeats. He is clearly operating at a different level with different materials, entire visions of human behaviour. So, 4 very, very different poets. So what does this help us to see? The first thing it helps us to see is that the wrought category thinks that it is the at the top of the hierarchy and the arbiter of what constitutes poetry. And so what it does is it reduces first of all, it insults the poetry beneath it. The second thing is that it reduces what's above it, wildness, to whim. What do I mean by that? I mean that it believes that it is essentially the same thing as a formless kind of personal, sentimental expression. And it's not. It might share an affinity with it, because it's relatively formless, as I said before, but it is not the same thing. It's ontologically distinct. Likewise, it also does the same thing with wisdom, although it doesn't put wisdom, Shakespeare, Blake, Dante, Goethe, it doesn't put them beneath it, it puts it on the same level as it. So scholars tend to view themselves, the scholars, as working on the same level as the greats. Now, they won't say that explicitly, but that's what they embody in their praxis. So when they write poetry, they are statically representing the forms of the greats, and they are trying to do the same thing. And there is an analogy that they are making in their praxis with themselves and the wisdom poets. That's why the wisdom poets tend to so often inspire legions of poets who write in the same way, use the same forms, as though that's what the wisdom poets were doing. The wisdom poets had great technical flair and capability, yes, but that's not the point. The point is the essence and the vision, rather, that they are capturing with successful technique. It's a bit like the tide washing up shells in a particular pattern, then people coming along and looking at the pattern and then thinking, this is a really nice pattern, I'm going to be as artistic as this, and I'm going to use a similar pattern, as though, without any of the tide behind it, and as a result, it isn't as beautiful. But that's not. They don't realize that, so they reduce wildness to whim and equate wisdom to wrought poetry. So this poetry ladder here becomes this. And nothing is above the scholars and their wrought poetry, really, anymore, for them, ontologically. And I think that's problematic. So they turn this into form, ethics, aesthetics, and they lose the wisdom component. And wildness is dismissed as formal sentiment. So, as I think briefly hinted at earlier on in this presentation, every level of development is going to have its own frustrations. Sentimentals, more developed than the masses, will be frustrated at their unexpressiveness, the fact that they can just live in instinct and action and not have to elaborate any of their subjectivity. The scholars, more developed than the sentimentals, will be frustrated at their undisciplined expressiveness. We've seen that. This is the primary debate going on in poetry at the moment. The senses, which I would count myself in, more developed than scholars. There are some aspects of that I won't be as developed in, so I'm not making that claim, but generally speaking, they have access to something that the scholars don't, and they're going to be frustrated at the aridity and the staleness and the low resolution representations of beauty and the virtue and reality and essences. And the sky is more developed than the rest. Presumably, I don't know, we can speculate, will be frustrated at the lack of vision in the expressions of the others, but also maybe they have mastered a kind of detachment and they're above that frustration, which I can understand too. So what does this afford for growing poets at any stage in their career? Basically, to carry the analogy or the metaphor through, climbing the ladder. So the masses, if they are moving, if they feel called to move along the poetic line of development, should start to work to grow in their subjectivity and their emotional expression and personal expression. The sentimentals should aim to grow in an objectivity of their subjectivity. And they do this through a study of tradition and form. The scholars, they are, if they have the integrity to do so, can grow in the transjective sensing of reality, of essence. Try to speak for something real, directly, through a shared being with it, rather than through a distant, analytical, traditional, formal, objective expression that misses out on what's real. And the senses should aim to grow in their vision of whole patterns of human expression, which is what Yeats aimed at and tried to work towards. So what I tried to lay out here, I think is just, a really useful map that can clarify and cut through a lot of these debates, and actually provide a bit of aim and direction, not just for the field as a whole, but individual poets in their careers and development. So I'll leave it there, and we'll see where we go from here. Thanks for listening.